How important is your child's education? And most importantly, how much is that worth? A long debated topic in education is whether or not the country as a whole should adopt a solely privatized educational system. Public school systems are ones that are funded by taxpayers, and private ones are funded by the students. And these are most commonly funded publicly by property taxes, lotteries, and income taxes. The purpose of this speech is to compare the pros and cons of private and public schooling and show why public schools are the best option for developing an educated workforce. This speech will be divided by area to consider when comparing both public and private entities. Of the most importance are the areas of admission procedures, cost, student equity, and quality of education. The first most important part to consider is their admission procedures. Public schools are legally required to accept all students regardless of race, ethnicity, religion, gender, or sexual orientation, and private schools are not legally required to do so. In fact, most private schools, and even those that are religiously based, specifically limit their acceptance demographics towards their admissions and their ideals. This has the potential to create a serious amount of legal prejudice against specific groups of people and opens the door for discrimination and potential discrimination-related lawsuits. Another area to consider is cost. The reality is that educating students to the standards of modern society is just going to be expensive. The cost per student between public and private schools is very similar. At over $12,000 on average being spent per student per year for education, the U.S. is tied with Switzerland for the top spot in per capita student expenditure. And according to the NAIS, or National Association of Independent Schools, the average day tuition for schools not a member of NAIS is $13,364 per year. So as you can see, the difference between $13,364 and $12,000 on average for public schools is really not that expensive, or is really not that big. Most private schools are not a member of the National Association of Independent Schools, so the cost is much higher for them, sometimes exceeding over $30,000. Per student, there is not a significant change in cost, but the real argument lies in who should be responsible for taking on that cost. The reality is that education has become integral to the progress and maintenance of society, and how we act and function is or should be a group effort. Do you want to live in a society full of people who can't read or write? And the problem is that if the level of education suffers for students, so will the level of education for higher ed, and that will narrow the pipeline for occupations such as doctors, teachers, or lawyers, or even worse, force departments to lower their standards, and neither of these options are really very good. The third area to consider is student equity. Private schools have the right to reject students based upon race, ethnicity, sex, gender, religion, and sexual orientation, but what is frequently neglected are the students with disabilities. Private schools can also reject them. In 2014, according to the National Center for Education Statistics, disabilities affect 12.9% of total enrollment. But what that doesn't say is, or what that doesn't include, is the people that aren't even documented. Public schools are legally obligated to provide an education and services to students with disabilities, and although this undoubtedly raises costs, it provides an equitable education to all, regardless of circumstances that, frankly, these individuals don't have any control over. And the fourth area to consider is quality of education. Are private schools in a position to provide a better education than their public counterparts? Perhaps, but I question whether or not that can be accurately measured. Test scores obviously can show student growth, but you are always going to have students scoring on both sides of the mean. The actual large difference in terms of academic performance has to do with the socioeconomic trends of enrollment between public and private schools. Those who can afford it and pay for it are more likely to also have other basic levels of Maslow's hierarchy of needs fulfilled, making learning much more practical. In addition, parents are more likely to expect a high level of academic performance if they're paying for it. Both of these variables have nothing to do with how the schools are run. So in conclusion, public schools with more adequate sources of revenue are going to serve as the best option for an educated workforce in terms of the scope of students affected, because they can't legally discriminate, and their quality of education. Cost is shown to be approximately equal unless the private school belongs to the NAIS, which even in that case, it's much more. The largest question becomes how much each individual family values education and how much they value learning. Based upon the current administration, that value seems to be quite low. It's rather sad.